The Apex was Cummins' early name for the engine we today call the ISX or the X15. Let's take a look at the Apex and talk a little bit about what it was and how it started. The early Apex had fiberglass covers, which was cover number 1, 2, and 3, that covered up the ECM, the wiring harness, and the fuel system. They did that for a couple reasons. One, they wanted the engine to look very neat and sleek. And number two, they didn't want the competition to see what their fuel system looked like because it was radically different. This was not a common rail system. This was a low pressure system. It had mechanical injectors and it had an IFSM. You can see my video all about the IFSM and then you'll know what we're talking about. On this engine, I've got some numerals here. So number 1, that fiberglass cover, underneath it was the engine's ECM. It was actually air cooled. It bolted onto a plate, an aluminum plate that went into the cylinder head intake manifold. And the plate had finning on it and had a very heavy plastic gasket with a rubber seal that sealed the boost pressure in the engine. And under number 2 was the IFSM, the gear pump, and the top part. And under number 3 cover, those were all separate covers, was the actuators. And then you can see your white fuel filter hanging down from the bottom there. Now, interesting enough, this engine did not have a fuel transfer pump on it, no electric pump. And if the fuel bled back, a lot of guys would crank the engine dead trying to start it. And if you look up on the top of the cover number 2 in the back, you'll see a hex plug and then an Allen plug. If you took that Allen plug out, you could pour fuel down there and fill the IFSM up, screw that back in, and then the engine would usually start. Number 5 was a electric transfer pump that Cummins came out with that we were installing on any engines that came in that had a starting issue. And the hardest truck to install it on was a Volvo because the engine sat farther back in the truck. But it was just a few bolts to bolt it on, and it had a little tiny module on it. And when you ran the wire to that up to the fuel solenoid, and then you had another wire, a set of wires that went to positive and ground with a fuse. And when you keyed the engine on, that would run for a couple minutes and prime the fuel system. And that stopped all their starting problems. The valve cover up on top is red fiberglass or rosin. Some of them had a chrome cover that says signature on it. And the only way to get that valve cover on the engine is if you ordered an engine that was 600 horse with 2,050 foot-pounds of torque. And that was called the Signature, and that was the premier engine, and that was a big horse. And the guys that had that, they loved it, and it ran. This engine has a massive one-piece cylinder head, and it has 24 valves in it. It had mechanical injectors. It had 2 camshafts. The injector cam probably weighs close to 45 pounds. Big camshaft. It had overhead rocker arms. It had 4 rocker arm shafts, 2 for the injector rocker levers, front 3, back 3. Same with the valves. The J-brake levers were on the valve shafts. And the early head gaskets, the very first generation, the liners had grooves in the top. Remember on the old 855s, they had a fire ring that the head gasket would get crushed onto and that would seal it. Well, on this, they had a groove in the liner and you actually put a steel wedding ring in it. And then the rest of the head gasket set down around that sealed your oil and water. And that big steel ring when you bolted the head on, there was no groove in the head. It got crushed down into the liner, and that's how they sealed the compression. They moved away from that back to a flat top liner. I was told that those big wedding ring seals, the first generation, they were designed so that they could leak a little bit if they had to. But it ended up being a design that Cummins moved away from, and they went to the flat top liner, their traditional seal, and that worked out real well for them. And today, the head gaskets on these engines are almost no problem at all. They went through their birth pains with the head gaskets. For a while, they had oil leaks in the back, and then they came out with a head gasket that had a little 1-inch square tab sticking out on the driver's side back of the engine, and that's how you knew you had the updated head gasket that had the oil fix in it. And they never really had any water problems with the head gasket. So it ended up being a very good engine. The head changed significantly when they came out with common rail. Of course, the IFSM went away, and you can see those changes in my series on the 559 series on fuel pressure checks. So this was the early Apex, and it had a no EGR cooler, no EGR valve. It had a regular old mechanical turbo with a spring wastegate on it like your old Cats did. And it had the IFSM. It had a standard water pump, and it was a bulletproof engine. And it had the 600 had the big concept gears with the springs in them, and you can see some pictures of that in other videos I did. And the engine was well built, well respected, and once you got the flat top liners in it, it was really pretty trouble-free. And it was a great engine. And in Australia, they had these things running at 650 horse with 2,250 foot-pounds of torque, pulling those caravans that had 8 40-foot trailers behind a tractor. So that was the early Apex engine. After this, most of the significant changes to the engine were due to emissions so that it could conform to the emission laws, and then to enhance fuel mileage and dependability.